So I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Marilyn Cochran-Smith. She is the John E. Cawthorne Professor of Teacher Education for Urban Schools at the Lynch School of Education at Boston College. Dr. Cochran-Smith serves as the director of the PhD program in curriculum and instruction from '96 to 2017. And she's widely known for her work in teacher education research, practice, and policy, and for her sustained commitment to teacher education for social justice with inquiry as the centerpiece. Dr. Cochran-Smith is the founder of Project Right, which you'll hear about during her presentation. It's a two-country research project at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. Dr. Cochran-Smith and the BC research group, Project TEAR, Teacher Education and Education Reform, published Reclaiming Accountability in Teacher Education. I believe you all have the cards. That's just recently published and very relevant to what she'll be speaking about today. She's written 9 other books, 5 of which have won national awards, and more than 200 articles, chapters, and editorials related to teacher education. Dr. Cochran-Smith is the past president of the American Educational Research Association, an inaugural AERA fellow, and a member of the National Academy of Education. She's received many, many awards, including AERA's Research to Practice Award, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Literacy Research Association, the Carl Grant Research Award from the National Association of Multicultural Education, and all of the major awards from the American Association of Colleges of Teacher Education. On a personal note, I had the privilege to work with Dr. Cochran-Smith when I was a graduate student at Boston College, where we studied learning to teach within a social justice-oriented program as part of the Carnegie Foundation's Teachers for a New Era program. I know firsthand Dr. Cochran-Smith's devotion to education and to being a true mentor. She never forgets that the work that she's engaged in is deeply connected to teachers and students in schools, and she truly is a lifelong advocate for just and equitable education for all. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Marilyn Cochran-Smith to you all this morning.
Thank you. I think we have this figured out, but we'll see. Well, that was me. Okay. Good morning. I'm very pleased to be here, and I want to thank Joe Weber and the rest of the REL staff. And especially I want to thank Susan Mundry and Karen Shackman, whom, as you just heard, are the co-leads for the Teacher Preparation Research Alliance. They started talking with me about the possibility of this event, I believe it was last July. So many nor'easters and blizzards later, here we are, and it only took a year to make this happen. So I'm really happy to see so many folks here today, a couple of colleagues, a couple of former students who have been out a long time, which only makes me feel older, but it's really nice to be here. So as you can see, I've been asked to talk today about equity and diversity in teacher preparation, lessons from research. And so I want to say a couple of words about both parts of that title. The first part of the title acknowledges the imperative we face in this nation to improve the quality of teaching and teachers and teacher preparation so that teachers know how to and want to work constructively, respectfully, and successfully with the increasingly diverse school population. The second part of the title notes that the perspective I'm going to be taking is based on research. And this is definitely a very important perspective, and one that you just heard from Karen. I've spent a good many days and years in my professional career pursuing. So for about the next 50 minutes, I'll be talking about some of what we know about teacher preparation for equity and diversity based on research. But I also want to say right here at the beginning that research isn't the only way, and sometimes it's not necessarily the best way, to know about this important topic. Learning from practice is also a really rich source of knowledge about teacher preparation. And that's one of the reasons I'm so pleased about the format for today's meeting, which has been so carefully planned. So the format concentrates on what we can learn both from research and from practice. and it gives time to consider the implications for practice and policy in specific areas. So I'm so pleased that, as Karen said, I get to speak twice today, now drawing on research, and then a little later after the panel, drawing on practice. And I want to assure you, don't worry, the second time is much shorter. So with all of that as a caveat, I want to turn now to this research perspective. These are the main premises of my talk. First, it's widely agreed that enhancing teacher quality with regard to equity and diversity is essential. I think we all agree on that, or we probably wouldn't be here. Second, there are many researchers who study teacher preparation in relation to equity and diversity. But these researchers engage in quite different social practices, and I'm going to come back to that in just a moment and explain what I mean. These differences shape and define the conclusions people come to about what we know about teacher preparation for equity and diversity based on research. And finally, just a general overview point that I'll come back to as I go. Across many different perspectives, there is actually very little existing research about teacher preparation for equity and diversity that deeply acknowledges the impact of social, cultural, and institutional systems and structures, particularly poverty, that have an impact on teaching, learning, and schooling. So, with that as an overview, as I've just noted, there's a lot of current research that's related to the preparation and certification of teachers who are committed to equity and diversity. So to identify the research for today's talk, I'm going to be relying especially on these two sources. The first, at the top, is a major review of the teacher preparation research that I led with my colleague Ana Maria Villegas, and some of you may know her important work, and several doctoral students who worked with us. We started by looking at more than 1,500 studies published in selected English language peer-reviewed journals. These were about teacher preparation broadly construed. And this research review was published in 2016. Then the second source, which is actually drawing from the first, pulled from that big review to look at studies particularly about teacher preparation for equity, diversity, and for working with students living in poverty. Let me go back to the massive review for a minute. We described the research on teacher preparation in that review as a sprawling field, a term that we use because we wanted to emphasize that research on teacher preparation is an emerging, complex, and multifaceted field, and that there are currently many researchers in many countries who are intensely interested in the systems and processes which teachers are prepared to and certified to teach. But these researchers work from multiple disciplines. They pose a lot of different kinds of questions. They use various research tools and designs, and they have different, sometimes competing, notions about what the goals of research are, about the purposes of education, and sometimes even about what actually counts as research in the first place. So to tame this sprawling field, we did two things. First, we conducted what we called a landscape review. That's a review that really tries to look at what research is out there, who's doing it, and how are they doing it. This was not a comprehensive synthesis or a review more narrowly focused like a meta-analysis that some of you are probably familiar with, that tries to tally up the results of various studies to produce a definitive statement about a particular question. That kind of review, clearly, would not have been possible when you start with 1,500 studies. Second, to tame this field, we worked from the perspective of research as social practice. Now, here's what this means. This means that we assumed that researchers' interests, commitments, and social experience, and not just their research paradigms or their research designs, guided the questions they pursued as well as the frameworks they adopted. So to analyze groups of studies, here's how we worked. I'm going to start at the top and go clockwise. We looked at how researchers constructed and framed research problems and posed questions. We looked at their underlying assumptions and including the logic they used in the way they made arguments. We considered researcher identity and positionality, as well as intended audiences for the research and research purposes. We looked at research designs, theoretical frameworks, and uses of evidence. And then we also identified important trends in the findings and in the issues. So for this morning's talk about what we know from research of teacher preparation for diversity and equity, I'm pulling out of that big review almost all US research, and it had to be directly related to the preparation or certification of teachers for equity and diversity. So what Ana Maria Viegas and I found was that there are three big lines of research in this area. Research, and I'm going straight across, research on the impact of policies regarding alternate teacher preparation or certification with the goal of equity and diversity. And pulling from that big review, only looking at US studies, only the concentrated in this area, there were 30 studies in this category. In the middle, and this is the biggest category, there is research about preparing white teacher candidates to work for equity and diversity. This is the largest category, and we had about 125 studies in this area. And finally, there is research about recruiting and supporting students of color in teacher education programs. And we had about 25 studies in that category. So what I want to do is to offer an answer to that question at the top of the slide. What do we know from research about teacher preparation for equity and diversity? But I'm going to argue that in order to get there, in order to try to answer that question, we need to compare and contrast those social practices that I just showed on the previous slide, in which researchers engage when they do the research in these areas. So for a while, I'm going to talk across the three lines. And before I go to the next slide, I invite you to notice the colors and the pictures at the bottom. The colors on this screen are somewhat different from the colors on that one. So I would suggest you look over there because they're actually more attractive colors. But I'll keep that color scheme throughout to sort of help you follow which line of research or program of research I'm focusing on. And I'll use those pictures as a guide as well. So we have the little Capitol building to denote policy. We have a young teacher, white teacher working with an African-American child. And we have in the third box an African-American teacher. So with the colors and the pictures, hopefully we'll all be able to follow along. So first, I want to ask how the researchers in each of these three areas constructed the problem that their research addressed. Now, the idea here is that research problems don't exist out there, just waiting for researchers to come and take them up. Problems, research problems, are deliberately constructed by researchers in keeping with their major assumptions about knowledge, about teaching and learning, about the purposes of schooling, and about the relationship of research, practice, and policy. research problems are also shaped by researchers' identities, purposes, agendas, and the larger policy and political agendas with which they align their work more broadly. And I'll come back to this as I go. So with research about the impact of policies regarding alternate teacher certification and preparation for equity and diversity, here's how the problem is constructed. And remember, this includes what logic is used. And you'll see where I'm going with this. So, how have researchers constructed the problem in this line of research? So here's how the argument goes. Teacher quality is the most important factor in students' achievement, but low-income, urban, and/or highly diverse schools have disproportionately fewer well-qualified teachers and high teacher turnover. Because licensing and teacher union policies are problematic, and because university programs don't produce teachers who are interested in entering and staying in highly diverse, urban, and often low-income schools. And those are really or. They're not necessarily all the same. So, policies permitting alternative preparation, certification, and entry have been set up, and this is the case in 47 of the 50 states, as policy levers to try to solve the problem of both teacher quality and teacher supply. That's the research problem in a nutshell. The studies that construct the problem this way often use the term the teacher quality gap, intentionally imitating the language of the achievement gap, and call attention to the failure of school districts, states, and especially university teacher preparation programs to ensure that diverse, low-income schools have high-quality teachers. Now, following directly from this construction of the problem, we found two broad research questions across the 30 studies in this area. The first, what are the effects of alternative preparation and certification pathways, entry routes, or selection recruitment programs on desired student and other outcomes in schools with low income, highly diverse, or urban populations? And the second question, what are the experiences of new alternative entry route teachers in these schools? Most studies that address the first question, and that was most of the studies, examined the impact of alternate pathways on outcomes like students' achievement, the distribution of well-qualified teachers across schools, the demographic makeup of teachers entering the workforce, teachers' sense of efficacy and preparedness, and teacher retention. They didn't all look at all of those outcomes, but they often looked at an array of those outcomes. The small group of studies that looked at the second question focused on things like the tensions between the goals of alternative programs and the actual realities of urban schools, or how alternatively certified teachers made decisions about whether to stay or leave their jobs. Now, I'm going to go to the second line of research. So with the second line of research, which you remember is about preparing white teachers to work in diverse or low-income or urban schools, there's a very different way to construct the problem and frame research questions. So with this group of studies, the logic goes like this. There's a profound cultural gap between today's mostly white teachers and their increasingly diverse students, which makes it difficult for many white teachers, not all, just put that in parentheses, to design instruction that builds on students' background and experience, and or which prompts white teachers to tend to see diverse and minoritized students' difficulties, when they have them, in terms of deficits and individualistic thinking. So, innovative teacher preparation learning opportunities are necessary to try to alter deficit beliefs, uncover with students how inequality is reproduced, and supply teachers who have social justice commitments and goals. Studies that construct the problem this way often begin by linking demographic data with data about growing outcomes disparities, such as the fact that students of color now account for just over 50% of total enrollment in US public schools. And some of you may have seen the report that just came out, believe it or not, yesterday from NCES. You may be interested in looking at that. While, do you want to wait? Okay, thanks. While white teachers comprise still about 82 to 83% of the teacher workforce. These studies that construct the problem this way tend to assume, and I'm speaking very generally here, so there are lots of exceptions, but the studies tend to assume that many, perhaps even most, white middle-class teacher candidates have lived their lives in racially and economically insulated communities with limited opportunity for contact with people different from themselves, and thus have limited understandings of the day-to-day realities, interests, concerns, and struggles of students from racial, ethnic, economic, and linguistic backgrounds different from their own. Also, the argument often goes in these studies, because many white teacher candidates have lived somewhat more privileged lives as members of dominant social groups, they may believe that the difficulties of students from marginalized groups are the result of their own lack of academic skill and motivation to learn, and/or the result of family and community situations and lives that are less supportive, while at the same time overlooking, and then I'm still talking about these studies, overlooking the major roles that inequalities in society and schools play in the construction of academic failure. So when the problem is constructed this way, and again, this is very generally speaking across a lot of studies, when the problem is constructed this way, we found one very broad general question with two major variations, and this again is across about 125 studies. So the big question was, what is the influence of course-based learning opportunities on white teacher candidates learning to teach students who are racially, ethnically, economically, and/or linguistically different from themselves? And these studies tended to focus on either the influence of courses conducted entirely on campus using innovative pedagogical activities, assignments, etc., or they focused on the influence of courses designed with a linked school-based or a linked community-based field experience. Most of the campus-based learning opportunities these studies examined were designed to help white teacher candidates inspect and think about their own beliefs about diversity, identify personal biases, and try to understand how inequalities are systematically reproduced. The learning opportunities that were studied in this group of studies included things like, exchanging letters with paired K-12 urban students, discussing ethnographic cases, showing how race influences children's schooling, or working in a community soup kitchen or after-school program as part of a course on the social context of education. Finally, here's the third way researchers constructed the problem and framed research questions about teacher preparation for equity and diversity. And this one is interesting because, as you'll see in just a moment, the first step in the logic of the argument is the same as the first step in the second group that I was just talking about. So, here's the logic. There's a profound cultural gap between today's mostly white teachers and their increasingly diverse students. However, teacher candidates of color bring firsthand knowledge of minoritized cultures and personal experience as members of marginalized groups, which enables them to build connections between home and school and prompts, maybe, a commitment to urban schools or to diverse populations. And remember, this is how the argument goes. These are the assumptions that are made. I'm not necessarily claiming that all of this is true. Okay. So, strategies for recruiting teacher candidates of color are designed as tools for improving school students' experiences and outcomes. Now, even though historically black colleges and universities and Hispanic-serving institutions have traditionally produced the largest number of teachers of color over the years, most of the studies we found in this line of research were conducted in predominantly white institutions. In addition to assuming that teacher candidates of color bring experience and knowledge that allows them to build connections between home and schools for students from marginalized communities, some of this research also argues that compared to white teachers, teachers of color are more apt to take teaching positions in difficult to staff or urban or very diverse schools and to persist in those studies longer. And there is actually mounting evidence that says that may well be true. So, following from this construction of the problem, we found two big research questions. First, what strategies are effective in recruiting teacher candidates of color into university-based programs, and then supporting them through the attainment of their teacher credential? And then second, many fewer of these studies, what are the experiences of candidates of color at predominantly white institutions in general, and more specifically in teacher education programs and courses? The recruitment strategies studied are usually things like who is targeted for recruitment, including students with undeclared majors at a university, high school seniors, paraprofessionals who are people of color and are already in the schools. So those were many of the kinds of strategies that these studies set out to understand. So just to remind you where I am with all of this, I've been concentrating so far on contrast between how problems are constructed and how research questions are framed in these three lines of research drawn from our larger review that have primarily to do with teacher preparation for equity and diversity in the US. Now, I want to speak very generally, even more generally than I was, about researcher positionality, audiences, purposes, and research designs. And I'm going to do this briefly, so we'll have time to look at one example from each line of research. And then I'll turn to trends in the findings. So again, I am speaking very generally, and I'm sure you can think of exceptions that don't fit the pattern. So in order to do this, I'm going to use this chart, and I'm going to build this chart as I go along. As you can see down the left, this has researchers, focus, design, purpose, and audience for each of the three bodies. So let me go right to the first one. With studies about the impact of alternate teacher preparation and certification policies, and when these policies are regarded as levers for improving teacher quality and supply for urban or low income or high poverty or highly diverse schools. As you can see, researchers tend to be social scientists in economics, sociology, policy, or education. They generally locate themselves outside of teacher preparation itself. They focus primarily on local, state, or federal policy, especially the personnel practices of regions, schools, and teacher preparation providers. These studies often use large-scale databases and quantitative research designs and methods of analysis. The purpose of this research is to inform and influence policy that has to do with teacher preparation and certification, and the audience tends to be policymakers and policy researchers. A much smaller set of studies within this first group is intended to critique these policies rather than fine-tune them, but that's a pretty small body of work. So here's an example of the first line of research. This is a study by Pape, West, Fullerton, and Kane. It's titled, "Does an Urban Teacher Residency Increase Student Achievement? Early Evidence from Boston." Now, I chose this specifically because it was about the Boston Teacher Residency Program, which I thought would be of interest to the people in this area, and before I knew that Ed Liu would be part of the panel. So I'm sure he can fill us in on continuing research, because this is one of the very first studies that, not only one of the first studies that BTR did, but also one of the first very careful studies that tried to look at the impact of an alternate program that went all the way to students' achievement. The authors here are university-based researchers in economics, public policy, and education. Their study, and remember, people construct problems, so their study addressed the problem of how to expand the supply of effective teachers for urban schools, especially in high-demand subject areas, within the context of alternative certification programs, which are widely debated. And this is a school district-based alternate route. Sometimes it's been called a third-way route, not fully alternative, because it does have a partnership with UMass Boston, which actually gives the master's degree. But I'm not going to go into any more detail about all of that. So here's what they did. They studied the achievement of Boston school students taught by graduates of the Boston Teacher Residency Program, and they compared that with the achievement of students taught by other novices in the Boston Public Schools, not from BTR. So it was BTR and non-BTR. The study found, as you can see here, that BTR was substantially more successful than other Boston area providers at recruiting a diverse teacher candidate pool. It was more effective at producing teachers in math and science, a major shortage area in this vicinity in Boston and a lot of other places here, and more effective at preparing teachers likely to stay in teaching through year 5, which is another thing they looked at in the study. However, the study also found that BTR teachers were not more effective than non-BTR new teachers in teaching English language arts, and were much less effective in mathematics, in teaching mathematics. To make this even more complex, however, the study also found that by the 4th or 5th year, BTR teachers outperformed veteran teachers. So in their analysis, they tried to take all of that into account and say, what's the overall impact? So taking into account the high retention rate, the researchers suggested that a program like BTR could have a modestly positive cumulative impact. Now, I want to take the same kind of quick look at the researchers, designs, and audiences for the second line of research. But I'm going to leave the first column up here for contrast as I go. So, informed mostly by sociocultural views of learning, the studies in the second line of research are conducted primarily by researchers who are also teacher preparation practitioners. They often focus on their own courses, their own programs, and their own students, treated as strategic research sites. The studies are primarily, again, but not always, small scale and qualitative. They use the data of teacher candidates' learning, things like teacher candidates' writing and other work, as well as observations and interviews. The purposes, very different from the first one, the purpose of this kind of work is to generate knowledge about how to enhance or critique the context in which candidates learn to teach. That's the main purpose. But then also to try to theorize more generally and conceptualize the processes and conditions of learning to teach more generally. The primary audience, which may be hidden behind those chairs, I just realized, so look at that one. Yeah, the primary audience here is other teacher preparation practitioners and researchers. Here's one among many examples. This is a study conducted by Esther Ohito, a Black teacher educator, self-described in that way. Her study was titled, "Making the Emperor's New Clothes Visible in Anti-Racist Teacher Education, Enacting a Pedagogy of Discomfort with White Pre-Service Teachers." This study focused on the problem, again, the way the problem was constructed, of teacher education courses and programs that generally do not take up issues of race, racism, and white supremacy in education. This was described as a self-study, and it looked at a course about race and social justice taught by the author of the study. She drew on the data of classroom interactions, interviews with teacher candidates, and their writing, including blog posts that they engaged in throughout the course. She examined what she called the pedagogy of discomfort, which was intended to deepen white teacher candidates' consciousness of race, racism, and white supremacy by openly discussing and writing about these issues in class. She used qualitative data analysis informed by critical race theory to analyze what the teacher candidates had learned and what she, as instructor, had learned. She concluded that although this pedagogy created emotionally charged and sometimes highly uncomfortable moments, it also, quote, agitated the status quo and opened up the teacher candidates, and she said herself, as a Black teacher educator working with white students, to new understandings. And finally, here's the third line of research. You remember these are about recruiting students of color into teacher education. Like the studies in the second line of research, all the studies in this third line were conducted by teacher educators who were involved in various capacities with the initiatives they examined, some in collaboration with institutional or external funding partners and other partners. The majority of these studies, again, use qualitative methods, although some also had quantitative methods which were used to analyze survey data. The purpose was to identify and improve local recruitment and retention strategies, and also inform practice elsewhere. So the audience is teacher education practitioners and institutional policymakers, and perhaps beyond that. Here's an example for this one. This is a study by Lau, Dandy, and Hoffman. Their study was titled, the Pathways program, a model for increasing the number of teachers of color. The researchers were all faculty members involved in the Pathways program in various capacities at their institution. The study addressed the problem of low numbers of teachers of color in urban and rural schools that serve students of color and employed many people of color from the students' communities as paraprofessionals. Lau and colleagues examined the impact of a comprehensive effort to diversify the teaching force by offering a career ladder program for paraprofessionals. Based on the results of an extensive questionnaire, they found that there were two major factors that contributed to participants' success: creative arrangements that secured release time with pay for paraprofessionals to attend university classes, which shortened the time to completing required coursework, and restructuring student teaching so participants could complete this without losing salary and benefits, often in the classrooms where they were already paraprofessionals. So with all of that, I want to return to the question I posed a few minutes ago. What do we know from research about teacher preparation for equity and diversity? So by now, I hope I've persuaded you that in order to answer this question, we have to consider all the qualifications and caveats involved about how people actually do the research. So the question really isn't, what do we know? But what are trends in the findings when researchers construct particular problems, pose particular questions, and design studies in particular ways and in relation to their own positionalities, fields of study, purposes, intended audiences, and larger agendas? As I hope I've made clear, the configurations of these social practices that go with these three different lines of research are quite different from one another, and so not surprisingly, they lead to different conclusions about what we know. So with that said, I want to do a look at trends in the findings. So it's important to know first that research on alternative routes as an education policy lever for improving the preparation of teachers for equity and diversity is characterized by inconsistent definitions of traditional and alternative pathways, as well as lots of variation in study designs. We've actually known this for a long time. There are more variations within the category of traditional programs and within alternative programs than between them, which makes simply trying to compare traditional and alternative programs to find the best route or the most effective route not a very sensible research question. And researchers have really come to that conclusion. Policymakers, not so much. In short, sorry for the policymakers who are here. In short then, and not surprisingly, the results of recent studies about the impact of policies regulating alternative teacher preparation and certification are inconsistent and ultimately inconclusive. So although alternative pathways have grown exponentially in many states and have often, not always, but often been favored by foundations, state, and federal policymakers, the weight of the evidence doesn't suggest that they are superior as a pathway into teaching, or that they are a proven solution to the problem of teacher quality and supply for schools with populations that are diverse, minoritized, or poor. Please note, the research also does not show that university programs are a superior route. So because we have the first conclusion doesn't mean we say, oh, well, these other ones must be better. Some studies have found small or no differences in the achievement of students taught by teachers from different pathways. Some have found that university-prepared and certified teachers were more or less effective in some areas and at some levels. And some have found that teachers from alternate routes or programs were more or less effective in some areas and some levels than other teachers. On the other hand, there is evidence that alternate teacher certification and preparation policies have the capacity to change the characteristics of the teacher labor market in some areas, including improving the academic qualifications of teachers and mitigating inequalities in the distribution of well-qualified teachers to traditionally underserved students. There's also growing evidence that some alternative pathways are more effective than university traditional, with all the problems in that term, programs at recruiting teachers of color. And this finding is corroborated by other recent sources that show a significantly higher percentage of teacher candidates of color in many, not all, in many alternate programs compared to many university programs. And those findings are subject to all of the issues about how we define those terms that I mentioned a minute ago. Trends in the findings for the second line of research. You remember that this line of research was the biggest group of studies I pulled from. These were about the search for powerful strategies to use in courses with or without paired field experiences. The focus of the overwhelming majority of these studies was finding strategies that would alter teacher candidates' beliefs, especially their beliefs about diverse learners, helping them move away from deficit views and toward more affirming views. Overall, this research attests to the challenges involved in preparing white, middle-class teacher candidates to teach students whose cultural and social biographies differ markedly from their own. Most of the studies, however, reported positive findings. That is, the learning interventions they investigated seemed to help participants think more complexly about aspects of diversity, or they helped white teacher candidates develop greater understandings of themselves as cultural beings, or they enhanced their sense of efficacy as urban teachers. But across this work, there was little evidence of the profound shift in teacher candidates' perspectives that many educators consider fundamental to becoming equity-minded and socially just teachers. In addition, and with some exceptions, the pedagogies examined in these studies were not particularly innovative. For example, the usefulness of autobiographical writing and simulations as tools for promoting understanding of diversity is already pretty well known and pretty well established in the field. Although the recent studies confirm the known value of a number of teacher education pedagogies and practices, the research actually adds relatively little to the field's understanding in a general way in this area. So Ana Maria Villegas and I concluded that the contribution was more in the window this kind of research offers into teacher candidates' thinking about these issues and their sense-making regarding issues of diversity. And some studies help to theorize teacher candidates learning to teach. For the most part, the studies of school-based learning experiences, such as shadowing students in school and tutoring diverse students, were similarly limited. But some showed the potential of school-based learning opportunities to merge theoretical and practical aspects of teacher education when they were purposefully interwoven with courses. Of all the learning options examined in this body of research, we concluded that community-based learning experiences embedded within courses was perhaps the most innovative. Now, of course, cultural immersion experiences to expand teacher candidates' understandings of the lives of people different from them have been used successfully in some multicultural teacher education programs since the 70s. And looking around this room, there may be one or two people who remember those days, along with me. The success of those approaches has been attributed largely to the opportunity they gave participants to spend time in settings where they were in the minority. But today's research has a different take on this. In the more recent research, cross-cultural immersion has been reconfigured as shorter, less intensive, community-based experience strategically connected with the content of coupled courses and designed to give teacher candidates more access to seeing and understanding children's strengths and their potential in context outside of school. More opportunity to see this than teacher candidates have in regular field work, even when it's in diverse schools. Collectively, these studies provide preliminary evidence to support the value of community-based learning carefully coupled with coursework. And that last part is really important. You may want to discuss that later. I won't say more about it now. Another point is that relative to the large number of beliefs studies, there were way fewer studies of how teacher preparation courses and fieldwork influence white teacher candidates' practice, although there are more studies of practice now than there have been noted in previous reviews of the literature. But we still need, I think, a lot more research about the conditions and context in which white teacher candidates develop a repertoire of culturally responsive, socially just teaching practice. In addition, whatever the approach, the overwhelming majority of these studies was conducted in the context of a single course. Rarely were these course-embedded interventions situated in the discussion of the research within the context of a larger program. And rarely was there follow-up about what happened to those supposedly changed beliefs, and not even to mention practices, of white teacher candidates after the course. As a result, the literature gives what we determined was an incomplete and somewhat fragmented picture of white teacher candidates learning to teach for equity and diversity. Finally, trends in the findings in the smallish group of studies about recruiting teacher candidates of color into university teacher preparation. So these are the trends. In general, the recruitment studies confirmed what was already fairly well known from previous research on this topic, namely that the success of minority recruitment and retention programs hinges on two factors: the availability of scholarship funds or other funding or timing arrangements that promote flexibility, and the existence of strong partnerships, typically involving one or more colleges and universities, school districts, and community-based organizations. Studies about the experiences of students of color enrolled in teacher education programs, and remember, these studies were conducted primarily in predominantly white institutions, revealed that the interactions of teacher candidates of color and white teacher candidates and faculty were a source of significant tension, often leaving candidates of color feeling like outsiders to the program and the institution. These studies pointed to numerous incidents that teacher candidates of color found culturally insensitive, like hearing classmates make racist comments that were unchallenged by professors, despite the so-called justice orientation of the program. Consistently, studies in this group showed that such experiences made teacher candidates of color feel devalued and marginalized within their program, and sometimes led to dropping out of the program or choosing not to pursue a teaching job. One piece of very good news, I think, in this area is there's actually a new handbook of research on teacher candidates of color, so a whole handbook that is currently in production. So it won't be available for a while, but it will bring together a lot of new studies in this area that really, I think, digs more deeply into what the experiences of teacher candidates of color are. They talk a lot in the most recent studies I've read about just not getting, why do they want us in the program? Why are they recruiting us, teacher candidates of color, so heavily? You would think it was because they thought we knew something, but when we get here, they don't value the knowledge that we do bring. So I think in this new handbook, there'll be studies that will take up some of those issues. All right, so this is the last part of this talk, and it's short. I just want to make a few general comments and critiques about what we know from research about teacher preparation for equity and diversity. And I want to emphasize again, I'm talking in very broad brush strokes here, so you will easily think of exceptions to the general points I want to make. First, I hope I've made it clear that there are important differences across these three lines of research. But all three are based on the premise that the status quo of teacher preparation is failing to provide enough well-qualified teachers for schools with increasingly diverse and minoritized populations. And this is true at least for the time period that we drew on for these studies. And as I just gave the example about the new handbook, I think there's more research emerging about these very kinds of questions. But as I've shown, the studies within these three lines of research understand and respond to the failure of the status quo very differently. As the left box shows, with the alternative teacher preparation and certification studies, the failure of the status quo is regarded primarily as a policy problem, where the goal is to determine which of the broad parameters of preparation and certification that can be controlled by policymakers is most likely to enhance teacher quality and supply for urban schools. In contrast, with the studies about preparing white teacher candidates in the middle, the equity and diversity, or the failure of the status quo is seen as what I'm calling a learning problem, in contrast to a policy problem. That means that the problem for teacher education is understanding and constructing the context within which white teacher candidates can learn knowledge and skills and can retain those knowledge and skills after they leave particular courses. The studies about recruiting teacher candidates of color in the far box are something of a hybrid. They see the failure of the status quo as a local institutional level policy problem that also involves constructing the conditions and contexts that support teacher candidates' learning. Despite the differences in the second and third, they also have a lot in common, which I hope you've noticed as we've talked. And they are markedly different from the studies on the far left. In fact, much of the research to the left and to the right of this pink line I've drawn here has grown up in what we described in our review as segregated research spaces as a result of profound differences in researchers' purposes and disciplines, their positionalities as insiders or outsiders to the professional teacher education community, their larger political and policy agendas, and the extent of available resources and infrastructure and funding. The studies in the first box have way more have had way more funding over the years. Many of the studies in this left-hand column are consistent with the dominant approach to education reform, including many of the assumptions are made. I'm not going to say more about that now. Perhaps people will want to have discussion about that. And the other ones are much less consistent with the dominant education reform movement. With that said, I just want to make two other critical points about all three of these lines of research. With some exceptions, most teacher preparation research in the US does relatively little to interrogate the needs of, quote, diverse students, or of students living in high poverty or attending poor schools. The studies in the first line don't attend much to these issues at all, but the studies in the second often use the language of diversity or multicultural very generally as a kind of undifferentiated code for these issues, but without elaborating or really unpacking them. This is true to a certain extent of the studies in the third line as well. Finally, I think it's important to note that all of the studies I've considered today are intended to challenge inequalities and enhance educational equity. However, in many of the studies, as I've noted, educational equity is constructed as increased access to good teachers without interrogating the existing social and material relationships that created inequitable access to teachers and knowledge in the first place. In this sense, much of the research aims to generate knowledge that could inform the creation of new avenues to educational access, but it may actually mask and help to conserve the fundamental power relationships and societal structures that have actually reproduced these inequalities. We found a relatively small number of studies, some in the second, some in the third group, that were based on the assumption that teaching and schooling are deeply political, not neutral, and that neither schooling nor society nor teacher preparation are meritocratic. To the contrary, they assumed that schools and teacher educators are complicit in the construction of students from minoritized groups as deficient, and thus complicit in the reproduction of inequalities. There were very few studies that really did that kind of heavy critique. Very few of the studies unpacked the concept of poverty in detail or examined the preparation of teachers in relation to those issues. I think we need much more research along those lines. This can be conducted from many different approaches using many different research designs, but I think it must deeply acknowledge the impact of social, cultural, and institutional factors, particularly poverty, on teaching, learning, and teacher education. Thank you. So, a few questions.
So it would be great if people came to the mics because we're recording, so come on up to the mics if you have questions. If you know you're going to have a question and you're generating it right now, get in line.
I had this one for a moment or two. In your third, I'm particularly in your second box. Is this good? Okay. In the second box. Oh, I'm sorry, George, Coleman, Connecticut. Is it possible to, I want to get back without the script there, in the middle where we're defining. I'm wondering what would have been the impact if we, and why you might have not selected to identify preparing white teachers to teach the concepts of equity, social justice, and whatever to white kids as a universal value, and how it might have supported the box in the middle and beyond.
And
primarily
what was
because
the last beyond? Oh,
and
beyond.
the box in the middle and the box on the end. Because a part of what minority teachers who are recruited are frustrated by is the fact that, one, their knowledge often is, as you say, undervalued, their experience is undervalued, and it is isolated within the context and within the perspective of those who share the general responsibility.
Thank you. That's a really interesting and important question. One of the things that's important to emphasize here is that what we were doing was to say what research is out there. What are people mostly doing? What are the trends and patterns? How are they constructing the problems? So we found very, very, very little research that addressed or that constructed a problem in the way that you were just talking about it, or asked research questions there. So the vast majority of the studies, and I couldn't give every example, the vast majority of the studies were about preparing white teachers to work with school students who are different from them. Very often, that was stated explicitly. Occasionally, it wasn't, and it was, if you just read on the surface, you would have the idea that this was preparing teachers for diverse student populations. But if you dug into it and got a little more detail, we found in the vast majority of cases they were talking about white teachers. So when the teachers weren't named in terms of demographic background, it turned out that they were primarily talking about white teachers. So I don't disagree with you at all that preparing teachers to work with students of many different backgrounds, including white students, including students who have lived lives of relative privilege and status, that's incredibly important, and that those students and their schools and their communities are the poorer if they haven't had that. We didn't find that in the literature. I think it's a really good line of work, and if anybody's looking for a research problem or a research question, I think that's a really important avenue to pursue. There were a few, but really I was trying to talk here about the patterns, and that was just not a big trend.
Barbara Moody from Maine. Dr. Cochran-Smith, I was intrigued by your idea that there has been little research on generalizing what's learned in particular courses and applied to entire programs. And I am wondering if you found any models of integration that promoted that kind of thing.
Okay, so let me just clarify a little bit. What we found was that the vast majority concentrated on an individual course or fieldwork opportunity, even an individual assignment, a single assignment. What they didn't do was to locate that course in the larger program. So not necessarily that the people there weren't generalizing in some way, but in the research that they published, which is the primary way we know about what they're talking about, they didn't locate the course, so we didn't know how that course fit with other courses in the program, or how that course fit with fieldwork, or other context for learning, or other experiences that teacher candidates had. We saw actually over time, we saw a little bit more attention to those kinds of things. We were looking at a almost 15-year period of research. And toward the end, there was a little bit more. But much of the work was about this course. Now, I think I know partly why, because there hasn't been much funding. There hasn't been much money for these kinds of studies, and it costs something to have a larger research design with a more varied kind of data sources used. So me, little old me, teacher educator, without spending too much money, I can study something in the context of my own course. And I think that has had a lot to do with why the research tends to look like that. We also did find, and I'd be happy to invite you to read the larger chapter, and I'll tell you where to look. We did find some studies that were trying to look at programs as a whole. But again, that was a small body of work. I think, again, because it's not something an individual can do alone, there has to be a research team, there has to be I think, a more complex research design and so on. So it's not to say it's absolutely important. We just haven't seen too much of it so far.
Hi, I'm Flynn Ross from the University of Southern Maine. Thank you very much. I hear in this and in your response there a critique of the way the research has been done, and this, you drew those pink lines to sort of separate them. In your ideal world, how would we fund and support research going forward so that we bring the policy and the practitioner together and, as you say, maybe fund research that might be a little more robust?
Well, that's a really good question and a really hard question. We do, at the end of this chapter, have about 10 to 12 pages worth of what we think needs to happen and the kinds of questions we think ought to be pursued and the questions that haven't been pursued. So I certainly think it would be great if there could be funding for multiple research designs, for qualitative studies as well as quantitative studies, for mixed method studies. That's been a really difficult area, I think. We found almost no research that connects teacher preparation to students learning except the policy studies in the first category. So with the other two bodies of work, the assumption seems to be something my colleague Susan Lytle and I said many years ago. The assumption is that teachers who know more teach better, and then there's some sort of vague belief that then it will be better for students. Without connecting the lines and without really exploring a teacher preparation study that actually gets at kids learning. So I think we need work like that. We found very, very little research where teacher educators worked with parents, communities. Now that is increasing. There is some work, and some of you might know there's some work at Ohio State, there's some work at University of Washington. I think that's a line that is starting to emerge. But I think we need more of that kind of work as well. And I certainly think, as I was trying to make clear, we need work in the area of equity and diversity where there's a lot of attention to really unpacking what these terms really mean, rather than this sort of synonymous treatment of equity and diversity and justice and equality and happy ever after, without really defining what those things mean and what the deep underlying causes and consequences are. But please read the last part of the chapter because I think it's more cogent than I just said it, and I think you might find it interesting.
We have time for one more question. But you were there first, and I'll make sure Pam talks.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, I'm Anita Charles, also from Maine. My work is in teacher education and working primarily with white candidates, and we are placing them consistently and early into very diverse and unusual kinds of situations. And again, I appreciate your point about teasing apart how we define these terms. But my question is that you You talked about challenges in changing views, deeply changing views for white candidates around to be more strength-based and changing their beliefs and practices. And you said that this research indicated some shifts, but not profound shifts. And I was struck by that because I put myself immediately into the classroom with my own undergraduates, and I am imagining the changes that they experience over their 4 years, and I'm imagining the ways in which they have said to me, gee, I hadn't thought about this, or wow, I'm learning about that. And I'm trying to understand what it means to have a profound shift. How do I have a 21-year-old undergraduate coming out of their own life experiences, how do I measure a profound shift versus I'm working on it, I'm getting there, but I won't be there for a while, versus, okay, I touched it, but I'm coming back to my comfort zone. How do I begin to know whether my students are engaging in profound shifts of beliefs and practices?
That's a really good question and a really hard question, too. There are several different things, I think, in the question you just asked, and I think the latter part of what you were emphasizing was, how do I know, how do I measure that? And I think if you're talking about undergraduates that whom you have the opportunity to work with for 4 years, you do have an opportunity to look at change over a 4-year period. There are a variety of instruments. If the focus of your question is really about measurement, which I'm not sure it is, but there are a variety of instruments that I think can be used along those lines. I'm going to talk about one of them in the second little bit that I'm going to say. But I also think that in order to get at profound change, it has to be an approach that is more than a single course and is more than a single sort of snapshot look. If you really want to look at deep change and you have people for 4 years, you probably have to follow them for those 4 years. And then you probably have to know what happens to them when they get into classrooms and schools, where even if they've had the beginnings of profound change, some of the people in their schools might not have. So this is, I think, an enterprise that is huge. It's well beyond any of us as individual researchers or individual teacher educators. But I think asking questions like that, how do I know if this change is profound, or maybe a slightly more modest term? I think those kinds of questions would be really important questions for research. And I think there would be groups of people, perhaps in your own institutions, perhaps across institutions, where people who are committed to this kind of thing developed perhaps multi-site research studies, which is one way to increase the value of the single course, single researcher kind of an approach. So I don't know if that really got at what you wanted, but Karen is, yes, she's lurking.
I am lurking. We'll do that well. All right, well, first, why don't we say thank you to Dr. Cochran-Smith.